Welcome back to the show, Cherries fans, Wolves fans, and of course the rest of the Premier League. Good to see you here. And please, before you do watch further, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and hit the bell button. It helps this channel to grow. Now, of course, we are coming up against a man that we know very, very well. A man called Gary O'Neill took over from Scott Parker after our 9-0 thrashing at Liverpool. His first game in charge was actually against Wolverhampton Wanderers, the side that he was later to manage. He was criticised heavily, PE teacher, clown, and even worse, by some of our vocal minority here at Dean Court. Gary O'Neill has shown, though, he isn't a one-trick pony. And he's shown how good a manager he really is by leading Wolverhampton Wanderers up the league. And if it was not for some contentious VAR and refereeing decisions, they could well have been even higher up, maybe even in that sixth spot at this moment in time when everybody had them destined to be relegated. Now, I've got a very special guest on for this preview. Now, this man is a journalist for the Express and Star. He's also one of the figureheads at Sky Sports. You'll be able to see him around the grounds on Soccer Saturday. You'll also be able to see him as the Wolves ambassador. He's part of the Wolves ambassador team. It is a pleasure to welcome onto the show from Sky Sports, Johnny Phillips. Welcome to the show, Johnny. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well. Nice to be speaking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, everybody will recognise you from Sky Sports, but you also do quite a bit with the Express and Star. You're a journalist for them, and also you are the Wolves ambassador, one of the Wolves ambassadors, aren't you?
Yeah, it's quite good fun. I enjoy the writing side of it. So I do a weekly column for the Express and Star newspaper, which has led to a couple of books as well about Wolves down the years. And then,
Yes.
yeah, I've got a role with the Wolverhampton Wanderers Foundation, who do a lot of good work in the area, just an ambassadorial role for them. We're doing a theatre night in a couple of months, actually next month. Gosh, time's flown. Next month in Wolverhampton, helping raise awareness for a few of the programs that the foundation supports. So it's really good. It's good fun.
Perfect. Excellent stuff. And all the very, very best for that. Now, what I wanted to firstly bring up is, I know everybody will be expecting me to bring this man up, is Gary O'Neill. Now, firstly, what did you make of the job that he did at AFC Bournemouth last season?
I thought he did a great job, actually. Towards the end of last season, I covered one of the games in that. I think they won 6 of 9 towards the end of the season in that winning streak. And yeah, from afar, without knowing the ins and outs of it, it looked like he'd done a really good job. Obviously, it took some time. There were lots of moments where it certainly looked as if it wasn't happening for him. But then as things sort of progressed towards the end of the season, I think it was the win over Leeds. Would I be right in saying it was a win over Leeds?
Yep.
Yeah. I covered towards the end of the season, and it started to look as if things were finally working for him, and then that run sort of ensured that Bournemouth survived, really. So from afar, it looked like he was doing a decent job.
Yep, and I completely agree with you. However, and I'll take it back to when he actually first got appointed, because of course his first game for AFC Bournemouth was against Wolves in a 0-0 draw. Now, after the back of a 9-0 thrashing against Liverpool under Scott Parker, it might not sound the most exciting game. It wasn't the most exciting game for either set of fans, but in fact, when I look back at it, it was probably one of the most important results. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. And there are echoes of him, of what he did with Wolves as well, coming in after Julian Lopetegui, because Lopetegui essentially was saying that the squad wasn't good enough and there was going to be a lot of problems going forward, and that's why he left Wolves. And I think the messaging coming out of the previous management at Bournemouth was probably something similar, that there were going to be some dark days ahead and that Bournemouth may not have been equipped to survive in the Premier League. And he showed that Gary O'Neill immediately that the club could become competitive and that the team could challenge. And while I would have said Bournemouth were still favourites to struggle that season and become one of the relegation favourites, I think you're spot on there. And O'Neill found a way to become competitive, just as he has done with Wolves, and that result sort of showed it really. And then from then on, that things sort of transpired the way they did, and Bournemouth were able to stay up eventually by the time we got to May.
I'll say this, sometimes the football wasn't the most attractive football, but it was effective. But I'm a big Gary O'Neill fan. I've met him myself. He was really, really good when I actually toured the stadium with a friend who unfortunately has passed away since. The club put on a great day and spoke to Gary. And at that time, I thought he's a very astute manager, very, very knowledgeable. No, it's exactly, if, say, for example, we was playing Brentford the following day, if Brentford do this, we do this. And I thought, it's the perfect way to management. It's scenarios. There was elements, and I would say it's the vocal minority rather than the silent majority who were quite unkind in their abuse of Gary O'Neill, were very, very critical of his style. And it was really, really disappointing. What do you say to those fans now that said that he was a PE teacher, a clown, and even worse in some occasions?
Yeah, I mean, the PE teacher tag was something that followed into Wolves in the very, very early days. There were a couple of sticky patches at Wolves, and there was a League Cup defeat away at Ipswich,
Yeah.
Which was probably the lowest point, and probably the point where there were certain fans were getting a little bit vocal. Without knowing how things turned around at Bournemouth, what turned it around at Wolves was sort of adaptability against different types of opposition. And that there was a win at home to Manchester City in there where he overloaded certain areas of the pitch where Manchester City was stronger. And, by no stretch of the imagination did Wolves dominate City, but they got the win. And I think it's that adaptability, which was possibly underrated. And when he came for an interview at Wolves, he wasn't the favourite, but he really impressed the club with his thoroughness and his methodology and his solutions really to problems that were put in front of him that I know one or two other managers who'd managed in the Premier League didn't really have answers for. O'Neill had a presentation which showed his thoroughness. And he's possibly been underestimated to this point, and perhaps he was underestimated in those early days at Bournemouth, really. And if it wasn't a surprise to Bournemouth fans that he left, it was certainly perhaps a bit surprising to fans who weren't watching the club week in, week out. So he's proved people wrong, certainly, and he's proved Wolves fans wrong who sort of undermined him at the start of this season as well. So there's probably a consistent pattern there.
Yeah, most definitely. And like I say, I am absolutely delighted that Wolves are doing well, but secondly, Gary has really taken off. And especially considering, he hasn't had the easiest hand taking over from Julian Lopetegui. It was literally a couple of days before the season started, so he had to get to know the players. But also, arguably the best player in the Wolves rank, Pedro Neto, of course, has been injured. And how's he adapted the side when Pedro has been injured?
Yeah, it's been really impressive the way that he has dealt with injuries. And Neto's such an outlet, and he's a real ball carrying outlet. One of the ways of getting around it is with his three up front, really, and bringing Cunha into a wider role and a more withdrawn role at times. It's something he's done. He's been a bit unwilling to do that all the time because Cunha is such a goal threat. But with Hwang Hee-chan and Pablo Sarabia, there are three reasonably effective players there that can accommodate for the absence of Pedro Neto. But most recently, and this is only a relatively recent thing, is Ryan Ait-Nouri being pushed much, much further forward. He began the season as a fullback and sometimes even playing as part of a three-man defence. That's how far back he was. But against West Ham, for example, the other week when there was no Cunha, when there's no Cunha, no Pedro Neto, no Hwang Hee-chan, Ait Nouri was pushed to a forward role, and he's excelled there. He carries the ball brilliantly. Perhaps after Pedro Neto, he's the best ball carrier at the club, which again goes back to that thread of adaptability, really, that O'Neill has made the hallmark of the success he's had this season.
Well, I'm going to mention this, but I feel, and I think a lot of the football community are waking up to this, that Wolves have been very hard done by. There's been loads of stuff spoken about Wolves could be in sixth spot if all the decisions were right and went for them. Jeff Shee has come out, and with regards to the terrible decisions, there's some that I've picked out. So the first game against Manchester United, when Onana clattered the attacker and committed a foul, it was definitely a penalty in my eyes. You had the red card against Luton, and then there was a penalty at the end where the player could not get his hands out of the way. A penalty against Hwang at Newcastle. Sheffield United had a penalty against you as well. And then, of course, most recently, we're talking about Max Kilman's, definite goal. Mark House has even said this, that, it was completely incorrect, to disallow it being ruled off. And I think Gary has got every reason, and he's kept quite calm up until fairly recently, hasn't he?
Yeah, I covered the West Ham game. I covered the one at the start, the Manchester United game, which was the Monday Night Football, and that still stands out as the most blatant for me. I just don't know how you can clatter someone the way that Onana clattered Kalajdzic on that occasion, and it not at least be flagged by the VAR. If you're going to have VAR, at least flag it to the referee. If the referee's missed it, fair enough on the day, but for the VAR not to flag it to the referee to go and look at the monitor, it was astonishing. And then most recently, I was also in the tunnel for the West Ham match, where things sort of boiled over, really. And O'Neill has since been charged by the FA, but his comments really were strong on that day. He called the decision scandalous and one of the worst decisions. I think his beef with that decision, because I said to him, did VAR muddy the waters on that occasion? Because the header goes in, and say, for argument's sake, the linesman flags immediately because the player is standing right in front of the goalkeeper. I think if you then go to VAR and the decision on the pitch has not been a goal, then there probably wouldn't have been that much sort of outrage in the stadium when it was disallowed. If it had been disallowed on the pitch, had it not been overturned, even though the attacker clearly wasn't interfering, had it been disallowed on the pitch, there wouldn't have been enough to continue with that. But what happened was the goal had been allowed because, clearly, even though he was stood in an offside position, there was no interference. For the referee then to be sent to the monitor for a subjective call, put it back in the hands of the referee, or put it into the hands of the referee once again. And then he gave the decision on the pitch, which was fine. But then to change his mind on a subjective call, that really did sort of rankle with all the Wolves players and the management and the supporters as well. And it was a clear case of how VAR has muddied the waters, messed things around. And I think it was probably the tipping point for lots of the sort of coaching staff and the players as well, because it was a really tough one to take that.
Do you feel that Wolves have been unfairly done by this season?
I feel that they've had quite a few that have gone against them. Once you go into unfairly done by territory, I mean, I don't think the match officials are being unfair. I think you can question the ability at the competence of the decisions they're making, but I think they're always making decisions being as fair as they can be. So there's always a section of support, I think, at any club that sort of buys into conspiracy theories or thinks there's vendettas against their club. I'd be really cautious going down that route. I don't think any such thing exists. But they have had a lot of decisions gone against them, and those decisions probably haven't evened out. So yeah, they've not had a great ride so far this season, but I don't think they're being treated unfairly.
one thing that we had our game against Manchester United recently, and there was quite a few contentious shouts. Of course, there was the handball against Harry Maguire that wasn't given, handball against Adam Smith that was, and those were quite similar. And then right at the very end, there was a holding offence against Ryan Christie where Christie was travelling into the box and the contact ended after he entered the box. Now, I know Mark McAdams had his say on this, and honestly, I completely agree with Mark, that it should have been a penalty. Of course, I would do because I'm a Bournemouth fan. But what do we need to do to make VAR better? And has the level of the officials gone down in the Premier League compared to the Championship?
I mean, there's two things. It'll never happen, but I really dislike VAR, and I think the football would be much, much better without it. And the reason I think that is because I think the paying spectators, the match-going spectators, are given a really raw deal with VAR. They're not kept in the picture the way that television viewers are. So they get the rummest deal of all. It's taken away that spontaneity of celebrations, which is another thing that I really dislike. So I get rid of VAR altogether, but I accept that's never going to happen. It's probably here to stay. It's one of those where in other sports that use television, they had a few teething problems early on. Rugby and cricket spring to mind, particularly cricket with the third umpire. So I think over time, we'll get used to a situation where VAR is probably smooth. Over time, it's smoothed out a bit more than it is. I also think that the laws of the game, as they're written, don't take into account VAR. They don't take into account the fact that decisions are now being re-refereed with the benefit of various camera angles.
Yeah.
And maybe if the laws of the game were looked at and written according to what the match officials now have access to, then maybe we'd be in a situation where it would perhaps be easier to referee games with VAR.
Yeah.
So I certainly think that might be something that's more likely to be looked at. In terms of the standard of officiating, a couple of seasons ago, there was a large amount of experienced referees sort of stepped down. I think there was Mike Dean, Martin Atkinson, John Moss. I also think one or two others spring to mind without being able to name them immediately. And they had to look at a pool of officials from the EFL. Now, when you do that one at a time, you can sort of make that step up become a bit smoother. But when a whole group are being promoted all at once, then perhaps it makes it difficult. So that might be where questions arise about the standard of officiating in general. And again, you only get to improve as a top level referee with the amount of matches you're refereeing. So I think the fact that there was a whole new crop came in at the same time has probably added to that sense that standards are dropping. But yeah, without any shadow of a doubt, I would say there are issues within the PGMOL that need addressing, and I know they want to address them, and I know they do their best, particularly in terms of transparency and what they're looking at in terms of explaining their decision making. We have that program that Howard Webb does. Refs mic'd up. It's all aimed at transparency. It's all aimed at putting supporters in the picture. So no one can say they're not trying.
No, fair enough. You do, of course, cover quite a lot of Championship games as well as the Premier League. But, from what I've seen, I just think that the quality in the Championship, because they haven't got VAR on their side, is a lot better, or it seems to be a lot better, because those referees are making their own decisions, like Mark Housey and Uriah Rennie, Paul Durkee, all those referees who are seen as recognisable figures from being so good at their profession. What's your response to that?
Well, I'd say it's probably easier to referee when there's no VAR, because you're not refereeing with VAR in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
So you are refereeing with more clarity on the pitch. I'd say that's without any shadow of a doubt, knowing that the decision made at that particular moment is the decision, full stop. So I think that's absolutely the case. that referees have more clarity refereeing in the Championship.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is that the analysis doesn't linger too long. So the other day, for example, we did a Leeds against Sunderland, and there were 2 penalty shouts in that game. Neither of them given, and there was a little bit of analysis in the studio about those decisions, as there would be. But really, the outrage ended there, in a sense. The action moved on at the time, so everyone in the stadium wasn't getting frustrated. I mean, that was the huge frustration the other day in the West Ham Wolves game. You know, minutes and minutes were passing as a decision was being waited to be made. In the Leeds Sunderland game, the Leeds fans all appealed for a handball. It wasn't given. We move on. So it's a far slicker operation in that sense, because it's a far more, I wonder what the word would be. Everything's more spontaneous, and it's more it's better, without doubt. It's a better experience covering Championship football. It's a better experience for supporters and for us as well, because there's none of these VAR delays, and everything is happening there and then, and there's no recourse to somebody back in a studio in West London re-refereeing the match. The goal goes in and the goal can be celebrated. So there's definitely more clarity of decision making. Whether or not it's better, that's a different argument altogether. The PGMO will say they've got the best referees at the top, but there's more clarity without any shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, most definitely. And like you say, the VAR delays are ridiculous sometimes. 7 whole minutes we had against Burnley earlier on in the season.
Yeah, it's not right. It's not
way too long. Way too long.
It's the supporters who, by the way, are paying a lot of money.
Yeah.
Who are the ones being let down by this process. They really are. And the things that appealed to supporters initially, and what they loved about going to the match, that visceral celebration, the spontaneity, everything going off, that's being taken away and being eroded by VAR, and that's a big problem in my eyes.
I think years ago, Johnny, you used to be able to take a bad decision because it would all even itself out after time. Referees were human beings and you took them as that. But when technology does come in play, it's a case of, people are still making these mistakes, but have got all the tools not to. So it would be better to get rid of it completely. But I know, and I agree with you, they're not going to do that. One thing I did want to cover with you as well is PSR. Now, of course, Everton and Forest have been hit quite heavily. Leicester also look like they're going to get a points deduction if they come back up. I had Richie Neville on the other day talking about Aston Villa, and he mentioned that they may have to sell players if they don't get in the Champions League. And I've heard that Wolves are also going to be under the spotlight as well. Is there truth in that?
Yeah, Wolves are okay. Wolves aren't close. There was talk that they were close, but I was actually chatting to Jeff Shee about a month ago, and he explained in clear terms why they weren't close. And if you looked at their latest set of accounts, the 2022-23 accounts they did to the 31st of May. You've got a month's leeway. I think Aston Villa this season, their accounting period goes to the 30th of June. You're allowed to move it a month, as long as once you've moved that accounting period, then the subsequent periods extend in that sense. Wolves sold Ruben Neves in June last year. If there had been a PSR tightrope, then they could have moved the accounting period to include Neves in June. They didn't, and I don't think they were close as perhaps people thought they were. But it's something that's ongoing. It's obviously, to some degree with PSR, you're only kicking the can down the road, because you've got to do the accounts next year. So by having Ruben Neves falling into next year's figures, it means that they're safe for next year. So it's always something that clubs are keeping an eye of. It's tough because it appears weighted in favour of the big clubs, but that's the way the market works. The big clubs' turnover, the big clubs' profits are just so huge. Match day revenue at places like Liverpool, Manchester United, Spurs, is just astronomical when you compare it to a club like Wolves. And certainly, without knowing the ins and outs of what Bournemouth can do on a match day, I know they haven't got huge amount of corporate facilities. I've seen the size of the club shop. I've seen the size of the supporter base. So there will always be that, most clubs will really struggle with PSR in its current format, whereas the clubs, the big clubs, so to speak, have got far more leeway.
Definitely, definitely. Do you feel that it's going to be very hard for somebody to do what Leicester did all those
Yeah,
years ago?
you have to remember that Leicester were one of those who broke the regulations when they got up into the Premier League the previous time before they actually won the Premier League.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. Of course, it's difficult, and when clubs do get promoted, they often found that they're within breach of the regulations. Were Bournemouth one of those? Did they breach as well?
No, we didn't. We
Okay.
didn't. No, so we were okay. We were okay. We did breach in the championship the
Yeah,
first
that's
time
what I
we
meant.
got promoted. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
we but
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So
So
Bournemouth, yeah. So Bournemouth breached in order to get promoted. So
yeah,
you can, and that was something that happened with Leicester. So it shows what clubs are finding they have to do if they want to be successful. It's really, really difficult, because and other clubs will then look at that and say, well, hang on, the reward for breaching was promotion and a whole new route in it, a whole new future. And the clubs will be hanging around in the championship who haven't, and will obviously have envious glances there. It's difficult. It's really, really difficult to know what can be done about it. I mean, in the NFL, they have that where there's no promotion or relegation, it has to be said. But in American football, they have draft systems, and
yeah,
they're always trying to make it a more level playing field. And that's probably one of the successes of the NFL, really, that it is very, very competitive, and that you don't have periods where there's just one or two teams winning the thing every single year for years and years on end, as has been the case in the Premier League. It's just difficult to know how it can be addressed. I do think the Premier League is better than a lot of European leagues in terms of its competitivity. I think if you go to other leagues, I mean, perhaps less so now, but for years on end, it's Real Madrid, Barcelona, and nobody else in Spain. I don't think
yeah.
it's quite been like that in the Premier League. And I certainly think the bottom of the Premier League is way, way more competitive and challenging than the bottom of a lot of European leagues, where the standard's really, really poor. So I do think there is a relatively healthy structure and pyramid structure in Britain, but PSR is absolutely an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Final question. Of course, you've got majority of your games left are at home. You've got Man City and Liverpool away. Um, can you get that European place, or do you think it's probably out of reach?
I think it's out of reach, simply because I think the players are running on empty, and a lot of them,
Hmm.
in that sort of strength and conditioning sense, are in the red zone and are
Hmm.
possibly at the limits of what they can do. The Bournemouth game will be a fascinating one next week. I'm covering that. I'm looking forward to doing it. Um, and even though you've got City and Liverpool in that list of teams being faced, it's teams like it's matches against the Bournemouth, which are just as important, really,
Yeah.
towards his ambitions in that sense. And it'd be really interesting to see how they get on in that. I think it's probably just a little bit out of reach at the moment, and I think fans have probably resigned themselves to that. I think the season sort of turned on that FA Cup defeat to Coventry City at home. There was a big opportunity to move forward there. I think it took a lot out of the players and the staff when they lost that one. And they'll be really hard pushed to go again in the Premier League, I think.
Will Gary do the double against us?
I don't know. I'm hugely impressed with Andoni Iraola. I really like him. And I covered Bournemouth a bit when they went on that incredible spell,
Mhm.
when things really started to turn for them. And I know it's sort of plateaued out a little bit since then. Um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's a double there to be done. I think Bournemouth got a big chance next week, even though it's away from home.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, hopefully, fingers crossed, and all the very, very best to Wolves, apart from, of course, our game at Molineux. Like I say, I would be absolutely delighted to see Gary, go from strength to strength. Of course, we want to finish above Wolves, but at the same time, it is good to see Gary, somebody who was doubted by so many of our own fans and so many, people in the media at first. Um, prove what he's all about. He's done a good job here. I think he did a fantastic job and was treated quite harshly. And I think he's done a very, very good job at Wolves, possibly even better. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with that. I think he's done a better job at Wolves, and certainly his stock is probably higher now than it was even when he kept Bournemouth up. I think that's fair comment.
Fair enough. Well, thank you, Johnny, again for coming on. Absolutely pleasure to speak to you, and all the very, very best for the rest of the season, of course, apart from Molyneux, and all the best with your book, your pieces in the Express and Star, and everything you do on Sky Sports. Pleasure to speak to you.
Thanks very much. Really nice to chat.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Remember, hit the like, the subscribe, and the bell button below to be alerted to any new videos we do here at the Cherries in all departments. Please do also check out our recent interviews. Of course, we had Richie Neville. I know the game has gone. However, it was a fantastic interview about his time with Five, his love for Aston Villa, and lots more. So please do go check that out. But we've not just had Richie on, we've had Gaz Whelan from the Happy Mondays. We've had Damon Minchella from Ocean Colour Scene. We've had Nick Owen, and of course, Harry's been on here several times as well. So he is a regular. Hello, Harry, if you watch him. But until the next show, up the cherries, and thank you for joining us.